I didn't think the moment my relationship with my parents truly died would happen in a parking lot, under harsh midday sunlight, with the smell of hot asphalt rising like a warning. But that's exactly where it happened. One minute, my dad was standing beside my car like he used to when I was a kid, hood up, hands moving with practiced confidence, acting like he was doing me a favor. The next, his body shifted. He blocked the driver's door with his shoulder like I was a stranger trying to steal something from him. And then he said it. Not quietly, not as a threat wrapped in concern. A real threat. He told me, his daughter, that if he ever saw my boyfriend again, he'd hurt him. I remember how my throat went dry so fast, it felt like my mouth had turned to paper. I remember the small details because my brain, in that moment, couldn't hold the big one. My dad is willing to get violent because I wouldn't obey. I stared at him, trying to understand how we got here. Because 3 months earlier, I'd been sitting at my desk at work, just another Tuesday, just another design deadline, when my mom called and did what she always does, skipped "How are you?" and went straight to, "What are you doing with your life?" That phone call was the first time I ever raised my voice at my mother. And when I hung up, shaking in the bathroom at work with water dripping down my wrists, I made a decision that felt like jumping off a cliff. I stopped talking to them. No contact. No explaining. No apologizing for being myself. I thought the hardest part would be the silence. I was wrong. The hardest part was what came after, when my dad called with a voice that sounded warm for the first time in years. And I let myself believe, just for a second, that maybe he was choosing me. That hope lasted exactly one lunch. Because when I tried to leave, he cornered me beside my car and showed me what family meant to him when I didn't fall back in line. And now, after the threat, after the tears, after I moved in with my boyfriend to feel safe, my mom walked into my office like nothing happened. She stood in my cubicle holding a takeout bag from my favorite lunch place, wearing that calm expression that used to make me question my own reality. As if we hadn't shattered, as if she hadn't cut me off, as if my father hadn't threatened the man I love. She looked at me and said softly, like this was normal, "Do you have time for lunch?" And I realized something terrifying. This wasn't reconciliation. This was control, served in a paper bag, with my name written neatly on the receipt. I'm Mina. I'm 23, and I design for a living. Visual communications, brand layouts, presentations that have to look effortless, even when my brain is screaming behind my eyes. Most people at my office know me as the girl who stays calm under pressure, the one who can take a chaotic brief from marketing, turn it into something clean, modern, and convincing by the end of the day. The one who brings a tiny sketchbook to meetings and pretends it's just notes, when really it's how I keep myself from snapping. What they don't know is that the calm isn't a personality. It's a survival skill I learned at home. Because I didn't grow up in a house where emotions were safe. I grew up in a house where emotions were evidence, proof that you were weak, ungrateful, dramatic, or, worst of all, disappointing. My mother's name is Nadia. She immigrated to the United States from Iran when she was young, right around the Iranian Revolution in 1979. She doesn't talk about it in detail the way people in documentaries do. She talks about it like a wound she refuses to bandage, like a story she has to repeat to prove the world owes her something. She became a U.S. citizen. She built a career in healthcare. She works brutal hours, 50, 60, sometimes 70 hours a week, and she's proud of that in a way that feels like a weapon. She makes around $75,000 a year. She's the main provider, and because she provides, she believes she gets to define what love is. To Nadia, love isn't warmth. Love is pressure. Love is expectation. Love is the constant reminder that you are the continuation of everything she lost. My father's name is Raza. He works at an auto repair shop. He's always been quieter, always been the man who fills his plate, eats his food, and tries not to disturb the air in the room. If my mother was the storm, my father was the person who learned to live indoors. When I was little, I mistook that quietness for gentleness. Now I know it was avoidance. He almost never contradicted her, not when she criticized, not when she punished, not when she decided what our lives would look like. And I say our because I'm not an only child. I have a twin sister, Isla, identical, technically. Same face, same birthday, same childhood photos where we look like mirror images in matching outfits. But personality-wise, we might as well have come from different planets. Isla is the version of us my mother can proudly point to. She did everything right. Science track, perfect grades, prestigious medical school. She doesn't fight my mother the way I do. She doesn't raise her voice. She doesn't say no unless she's already planned how to soften it into something that sounds like obedience. And I don't say that with bitterness toward Isla. I say it with fear. Because when you're raised by someone like Nadia, you learn early. There's a good daughter, and there's the daughter who makes the house tense. I was the one who made the house tense. I was the one who loved art, color, ideas. The one who could stare at a poster in a subway station and notice kerning before I noticed the person standing next to me. The one who wanted to design, not diagnose. Create, not comply. My mother treated that like a phase, like my interests were a childish hobby she could shame out of me if she applied enough force. And she did try. Every report card that wasn't perfect became a lecture. Every choice I made that wasn't aligned with her vision became a warning. Every compliment came with a hook. You're smart, Mina, so why do you act like this? You're talented, but talent won't save you. You're beautiful, but beauty disappears, so don't get comfortable. The older I got, the more I realized that in my mother's world, I wasn't a person. I was a project. And projects are meant to be managed, controlled, corrected. When I was 8, I fell off a playground structure and broke my arm in 2 places. I remember the shock more than the pain, the way the world tilted, the sound that came out of my throat that didn't feel like my voice, the hospital lights, the smell of disinfectant, the way my mother's hands shook when she signed forms. That accident changed her, or maybe it revealed what was already inside her. After that, Nadia became intensely protective, but not in a soft, nurturing way, in a controlling way. She monitored my friendships. She questioned who I sat next to in class. She checked in, constantly, but always with an edge, like she was hunting for a mistake. If I cried, she'd tell me crying wouldn't solve anything. If I laughed too loudly, she'd snap that I looked careless. If I wanted freedom, she framed it as danger. And my father? He watched. Sometimes he'd mutter, "Your mother just worries," like worry was an excuse to crush someone's breathing space. The Mina who smiled and said okay. The Mina who swallowed anger until it turned into acid. The Mina who hid her real life from her parents like it was contraband. That's why, when I met David, it felt like stepping into sunlight. He's white American. He works at the same company I do. He makes a good salary, and he's planning to go back to school to level up, because he's ambitious, but not arrogant about it. He doesn't talk like he's owed anything. He listens. He asks questions. He encourages my creativity like it's something worth protecting, not something to correct. The first time I showed him a design concept I was nervous about, he didn't critique it like a teacher trying to fix me. He said, "This feels like you," and something in my chest loosened. Of course, that meant my mother hated him almost immediately. Not because David did anything to her, but because he didn't fit the role she wanted for my life. To Nadia, David was trash with no future. Her words, not mine. She said it like a diagnosis, like she'd looked at him for 5 seconds and already knew his entire destiny. When my parents met him, my mother barely spoke. My father offered a stiff handshake and then stood behind Nadia like backup. Afterward, my mother listed his failures like a report. Wrong culture, wrong career, wrong aura, wrong for our family. And for a long time, I tried to keep peace the way I always had, by explaining carefully, choosing gentle words, trying to translate my life into something my mother could approve of. But every attempt ended the same way. Nadia would twist my words, raise her voice, become the victim. And I would leave the conversation feeling smaller, like I'd handed her my heart and she'd used it as proof I was unreasonable. So when that Tuesday call happened at work, when she launched into a lecture about how I wasn't progressing according to her plan, something in me finally broke. Not in a dramatic movie way, in a quiet, terrifying way. Because I realized, if I didn't set boundaries now, I would live the rest of my life as a version of myself built to keep my mother calm. And I didn't want that life, so I chose no contact. And that choice is what turned my family into a battlefield. Because in my parents' world, a daughter setting boundaries isn't adulthood. It's rebellion. Going no contact didn't happen with a dramatic announcement or a final speech. I didn't block my parents in a fit of rage or slam my phone down like a movie character reclaiming her power. I just stopped. Stopped calling. Stopped explaining. Stopped answering messages that weren't really questions, just traps disguised as concern. At first, the silence felt unreal, like standing in a room after a fire alarm shuts off, ears ringing, heart still racing, waiting for the next sound. I kept expecting my phone to light up with something explosive. It didn't. Not right away. And that scared me more. The first few weeks, my parents did nothing. No calls, no texts, no sudden apologies. It was like I'd stepped out of a frame they no longer wanted to look at. I told myself this was what I needed: space, oxygen, time to hear my own thoughts without my mother's voice narrating them. But the absence came with its own weight. I'd spent my entire life bracing against Nadia, anticipating her moods, decoding her silences, adjusting myself to avoid conflict. When she disappeared from my daily mental landscape, it felt like someone had removed gravity. I slept better. I stopped second-guessing my outfits before leaving the house. I noticed that when I spoke, my voice didn't automatically shrink at the end of sentences like I was apologizing for existing. David noticed too. One night, as we sat on his couch, legs tangled, a takeout container between us, he said gently, "You seem lighter." I laughed, but it came out strange, half relief, half grief. "I think I forgot what it feels like to not be on edge all the time," I told him. He didn't say I told you so. He just kissed my forehead and said, "You deserve that." That sentence almost made me cry. Of course, peace never lasts when control is involved. About 3 weeks into no contact, my Aunt Julia called. Julia is my mother's younger sister, and in every way that matters, her opposite. Where Nadia is rigid, Julia is relaxed. Where Nadia obsesses over status, Julia cares about connection. Where Nadia weaponizes tradition, Julia treats culture like something to honor, not enforce. She lives in Colorado. We don't talk every day, but when we do, it feels like breathing mountain air after being underground. She didn't start the call with gossip. She started with concern. "Are you okay?" she asked. "Really okay?" I told her the truth, that I was doing better, that I'd stepped back from my parents, that I needed space. She sighed, long and tired. "I thought this might happen," she said. Then she told me something that made my stomach drop. My mother believed I was pregnant. Not because I'd told her, not because anyone had seen anything. Because in my mother's mind, distance equals wrongdoing. Apparently, Nadia had been pacing the house, convinced I was hiding something shameful. A pregnancy out of wedlock. A scandal. A reason she could point to and say, "See? This is why she needs us." Julia said she'd tried to calm her down. She was spiraling, Julia told me. I just wanted to stop the speculation. So Julia did something she thought would diffuse the situation. She told my mother I had an IUD. The rage that followed apparently shocked even Julia. My mother didn't see it as reassurance. She saw it as betrayal, control slipping, proof that my body was no longer under her authority. A week later, I found out Nadia had removed me from her medical and dental insurance. No warning, no conversation, just gone. I discovered it by accident, through paperwork. I remember sitting on my couch, envelope open, staring at the line that said coverage terminated, feeling something cold bloom in my chest. It wasn't the practical issue. I had insurance through my job. It was the message. You don't get access to safety if you don't obey. When I told David, he didn't explode. He didn't insult my parents or tell me to confront them. He just said very calmly, "That's not love." And hearing it out loud made something inside me harden. Still, life didn't collapse. In fact, it kept going. I earned around $1,700 a month. I had savings, about $95,000, from a settlement after a car accident when I was a teenager. I wasn't dependent on my parents financially. I paid my own bills. I attended part-time graduate classes in graphic design. I split my time between my apartment and David's house, where I found myself staying more and more often. Not because I was running away, but because it felt safe. Without my mother's constant commentary, I noticed subtle changes. I made decisions faster. I trusted my instincts. I didn't feel the need to justify my life choices to an imaginary audience. Even my relationship with Ela shifted. We still talked, but carefully. She walked a tightrope between staying connected to me and maintaining peace with our parents. Through her, I learned that Nadia had started telling extended family members a very specific version of the story. That I'd become cold, that I was disrespectful, that I'd changed. Funny how setting boundaries always gets reframed as character flaws. But Isla also told me things that worried me. Our mother was working more than ever, 60, 70 hours a week, crying herself to sleep some nights, according to our father. Part of me felt sympathy. Another part of me felt tired, because I'd spent my entire life absorbing my mother's emotions like they were my responsibility. And I was done being her emotional regulator. The real shift came when my father called. It was the first contact from either parent in almost 2 months. His voice sounded warm, proud even. He told me he respected my boundaries, said he understood more than I might think. He talked about his past, how before he met my mother, he'd studied art, worked odd jobs, lived a life that wasn't boxed in by expectations. I remembered loving those stories when I was a kid. For the first time in weeks, I felt something dangerous. Hope. He asked if we could meet for lunch. David offered to come with me, or at least wait nearby. I told him no. This was something I needed to face on my own. The night before the lunch, I barely slept. I rehearsed conversations in my head, what I'd say if my father criticized David, how I'd leave if things turned ugly, how I'd stay calm if my mother somehow entered the picture. I told myself I was prepared. I wasn't, because I didn't yet understand that the call wasn't about reconciliation. It was reconnaissance, and the lunch would be the match. The restaurant my father chose was a small place near his auto shop. Nothing fancy, just polished wood tables and laminated menus that had clearly survived a decade of oil-stained hands and lunch rushes. I arrived 5 minutes early. He was already there. When he saw me, he stood up so fast his chair scraped against the floor. He leaned in for a half hug, awkward, brief, like he wasn't sure where his arms were supposed to go. I smelled motor oil and mint gum. For a second, I let myself believe this mattered. We sat. The first 10 minutes were harmless enough. Weather, traffic, a comment about how the place hadn't changed much. I answered carefully, like I was walking across ice I didn't fully trust. Then our food arrived, and the moment the plates hit the table, the conversation shifted. "So," he said, folding his napkin, "how serious are things getting with David?" The way he said David's name, flat, clipped, made my stomach tighten. "We're doing well," I said. "He's been really supportive, especially lately." My father nodded, but his eyes didn't soften. He didn't ask how. He didn't ask why. He just nodded, like he was filing the information away. Then he changed the subject to Ela. He said she seemed stressed, that medical school was taking a toll on her, that she'd been losing weight. That opened something in me. I told him everything I'd been worried about. The skin problems, the insomnia, the obsessive exercising. I told him I'd suggested she talk to a counselor or therapist, someone neutral, professional. The temperature at the table dropped. My father's jaw tightened. "So you think she needs a boyfriend like yours?" he snapped. I blinked. "No, that's not what I said." He leaned back in his chair, arms crossing. "You never listened to advice from your parents, so how would you know what we tell Isla?" I felt something sink inside my chest. This wasn't concern. This was defense. We ate in silence after that, forks clinking, the sound too loud. My appetite disappeared, but I forced myself to finish quickly, my body already preparing to leave. When he asked for the check, relief washed over me. Outside, the sun was harsh, bright, exposing. We walked toward my car, parked a few spaces away. And then, like muscle memory kicking in, my father stopped. "Let me check your oil," he said, already reaching for the hood latch. "I had it checked recently," I replied. "I've got an oil change scheduled later this week." He didn't listen. The hood popped open. He checked the dipstick, wiped it, checked again. "It's low," he said, like he'd caught me in a lie. "Not dangerously," I said carefully. "It's fine." That's when his face changed. Not angry, controlling. "What kind of man lets his girlfriend drive with low oil?" he demanded. I felt my chest tighten. David didn't do anything wrong. My father stepped closer. He blocked the driver's door with his body. I froze. "You think you're better than us now," he said, his voice rising. "You think you know everything." "Please move," I said. He didn't. "You're a disappointment," he spat. "Trash." He said it in English, not Farsi. Deliberate. Targeted. And then he said it. "If I ever see that guy again, I'll beat him." Something in me snapped, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. I stepped backward, walked around the car, got in through the passenger side, locked the doors. My father kept yelling as I climbed over the console, hands shaking so badly I could barely start the engine. I drove away with tears blurring my vision. Pulled over 2 blocks later because I couldn't breathe. My hands were trembling as I called David. He didn't ask questions. He just said, "Where are you? I'm coming." That lunch wasn't a misunderstanding. It was clarity. My father hadn't come to make peace. He came to pull me back into line. And when that failed, he showed me exactly how conditional his love had always been. I sat in my car on the side of the road long after the engine stopped shaking. My chest felt too tight for air, like my ribs had forgotten how to expand. I pressed my forehead against the steering wheel and stared at the texture of the leather until the world slowed enough for me to breathe again. I'd known my parents were difficult. I'd known my mother could be cruel, controlling, emotionally manipulative. But my father? The man who fixed my bike when I was 7. The man who taught me how to check tire pressure and told me I could always call him if my car broke down. The man who rarely raised his voice. I'd never imagined this version of him. The threat replayed in my head on a loop. If I ever see that guy again, I'll beat him. Not metaphorical, not exaggerated. Real. Directed. Violent. And suddenly, every memory I had of my father's silence felt different. It wasn't gentleness, it was permission. David arrived within minutes. I saw his car pull up in my mirror, and the tears came back, harder this time. He knocked on my window, concern written all over his face, and the moment I unlocked the door, he pulled me into his arms. I didn't explain everything right away. I couldn't. I just kept saying, "I'm sorry," over and over, even though I didn't know what I was apologizing for. He held my face gently and said, "You didn't do anything wrong." That sentence mattered more than he knew. We sat in his car while I told him what happened, every word, every detail. His jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. When I finished, he exhaled slowly. "That wasn't about oil," he said quietly. "No," I agreed. "It was about control." That night, I didn't go back to my apartment. I stayed with him, and for the first time since going no contact, I allowed myself to admit something I'd been avoiding. My parents weren't just unhappy with my boundaries, they were threatened by them. The next few days were a blur of emotions that didn't come in neat stages. Shock came first. I'd wake up in the morning and forget, just for a second, what had happened. Then it would hit me again, like my brain had tripped over a memory it wasn't ready to carry. Anger followed. Not explosive anger, cold anger, the kind that made my hands curl into fists when I remembered how easily my father had blocked my door, how naturally the threat had left his mouth, how little it mattered to him that he was scaring his daughter. Then came guilt, because no matter how justified my fear was, a part of me still wondered if I'd gone too far, if I'd been too harsh, if I'd misread the situation. That voice sounded exactly like my mother. Isla called that evening. She sounded anxious, her words tumbling over each other as soon as I answered. "What happened?" she asked. "Dad won't stop pacing. Mom says lunch went badly because you were disrespectful." I closed my eyes. I gave her the basics, but not the threat. Not the worst part. I didn't want to put that weight on her. She went quiet. "I don't know what to do anymore," she admitted. "I feel like I'm in the middle of something I can't fix." "You're not responsible for them," I told her gently, "and you're not responsible for me." I meant it. After that call, I blocked my father's number. It wasn't dramatic. I didn't announce it. I just removed his access. And the relief was immediate. A week later, I moved most of my things into David's house. My lease was ending soon anyway, and I was already spending most nights there. But this time, it felt different. Deliberate. Protective. His house had a small backyard, a spare room I turned into a home office, a sense of quiet that didn't feel like tension. It felt like safety. I asked Ela not to share my new address with our parents. She agreed, though I could hear the strain in her voice. Being the bridge between us was costing her something. Life settled into a new rhythm. Work deadlines, graduate classes, shared dinners, gardening on weekends. The dog David had adopted followed me everywhere like I'd always been part of the plan. And then, just when things felt steady, my mother showed up at my office. She stood in my cubicle holding a takeout bag from my favorite lunch place, her expression calm, almost fragile. She didn't mention my father, didn't mention the threat, didn't mention cutting me off. She just asked softly, "Do you have time for lunch?" And I realized the confrontation I'd been bracing for wasn't going to be loud. It was going to be quiet, polite, and far more dangerous. Seeing my mother at work felt unreal, like spotting someone from a dream, standing under fluorescent lights. She knew where I worked. Of course she did. She always knew. She stood there with a paper bag from my favorite lunch place, the logo folded just enough to show she'd remembered. Her hair was neat, her makeup minimal, the version of her that looked reasonable to outsiders. For a moment, I considered pretending I was late for a meeting. Instead, I nodded. We found an empty conference room with a glass wall that made me acutely aware of how exposed we were. I chose a chair closest to the door without consciously meaning to. She slid the bag toward me like a peace offering. "I thought you might be hungry," she said. Her voice was soft, careful, the voice she uses when she wants to be seen as the injured party. We talked about neutral things at first. The weather, a new shopping center nearby, my workload. She commented on how professional my office looked, how far I'd come. Then she asked how I was doing. And for once, I didn't edit myself. "I'm doing well," I said. "Work's going great. I got a small promotion. Grad school's intense, but I like it." She nodded, lips pressed together. I mentioned David, casually, naturally, like he was part of my life, because he is. "David helped me prep for a presentation last week," I said. "We joined a hiking group, too." She didn't acknowledge his name. Not once. Every time I mentioned him, she redirected the conversation. Asked about my health, my classes, whether I'd been to the dentist. It was subtle, strategic. Erasure dressed up as concern. Before she left, she said something I'd wanted to hear my entire life. "I'm proud of your professional accomplishments." It landed hollow. Because pride without acceptance isn't love, it's approval with conditions. After that lunch, she started texting occasionally. Short messages, polite check-ins. Never about my father. Never about David. Never about boundaries. I responded the same way. Briefly. Respectfully. Without opening doors I'd fought too hard to close. Through Ela, I learned what was happening at home. My father told my mother the lunch with me had gone badly because I was disrespectful. He never mentioned the threat. Never mentioned blocking my car door. My mother believed him, or chose to. I stopped expecting accountability. Meanwhile, Isla began to unravel under the pressure. She finally admitted medical school was crushing her. The weight loss, the skin issues, the obsessive exercise, the loneliness. I urged her to talk to a counselor. Weeks later, she told me she had. 6 sessions in, she sounded lighter, more grounded. She'd set small boundaries with our parents, limited what she shared about me, joined a study group that turned into actual friendships. I felt proud of her in a way that had nothing to do with achievement. When she visited David's house for dinner, she smiled more than I'd seen in months. I told her I planned to tell our parents that David and I lived together. She asked me to wait, just until after her board exam. I agreed. Because boundaries don't have to be cruel to be firm. Living with David hasn't been perfect. We're still negotiating chores, finances, quiet time, but it feels honest, shared, safe. The garden I started in the backyard has tomatoes and peppers now. The dog follows me like I've always been his person. As for my parents, I stopped asking whether our relationship was over. I started asking what was possible. Limited contact with my mother. No contact with my father. Clear rules about what I will and won't discuss. No more justifying my life. No more shrinking to keep the peace. And that fragile peace, with my mother showing up like nothing happened, felt temporary. Like the calm before something breaks. Because control doesn't disappear quietly. It escalates. The lowest point didn't come with shouting or slammed doors. It came quietly, on a night when David had already fallen asleep beside me, his breathing steady, one arm thrown protectively over my waist. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying everything I'd worked so hard to outrun. The parking lot, my father's voice, my mother sitting across from me at work, smiling like none of it had happened. I felt hollow, not angry, not scared, just emptied out. Because for the first time, I allowed myself to fully understand what I'd lost. Not the idea of my parents, the hope of them. Hope that one day my mother would choose curiosity over control. Hope that my father would step out of her shadow and protect me instead of the image of authority he clung to. Hope that setting boundaries would eventually lead to mutual respect. That hope died slowly and painfully over weeks. Every polite text from my mother that avoided David's name. Every update from Ela about how my father painted himself as the victim. Every reminder that accountability was never going to arrive wrapped in an apology. One evening, Isla called me crying. She'd just come home from a brutal day at the hospital. She was exhausted, emotionally drained, and our mother had criticized her for not calling enough. "She says I've changed," Isla whispered. "That therapy is making me distant." I closed my eyes. This was the pattern. Anyone who stopped complying became the problem. After the call, I sat alone in the backyard, knees pulled to my chest, the night air cool against my skin. The garden was quiet. The dog lay at my feet. David was inside, giving me space because he'd learned when I needed it. And suddenly I felt 12 years old again. Small, uncertain, wondering what I could do differently to be loved without conditions. That's when the thought hit me, sharp and terrifying. What if this is it? What if this is as good as it gets with my parents? No dramatic reconciliation, no breakthrough conversation, no tearful acknowledgement of harm. Just distance, controlled contact, carefully managed silence. The grief that followed was heavier than anger ever was, because anger gives you energy. Grief takes it away. I cried that night, quietly, so I wouldn't wake David. Not because I wanted my parents back the way they were, but because I finally accepted they were never going to be what I needed. And accepting that felt like mourning people who were still alive. The next morning, I woke up with swollen eyes and a strange sense of clarity. Painful, but clean. I realized something important in that darkness. If I kept waiting for my parents to change, I would stay trapped in this grief forever. And I was done living my life in reaction to them. The shift didn't happen all at once. It wasn't some cinematic moment where I woke up fearless and free, suddenly immune to the pull of my parents' approval. It happened in pieces, quiet ones, The morning after that long night in the backyard, I stood in the bathroom brushing my teeth, staring at my reflection. My eyes were swollen. My face looked older somehow, not in years, but in understanding. And for the first time, I didn't feel the urge to explain myself to the person in the mirror. That felt new. Later that week, something small but important happened. My mother texted me, "Just checking in, have you been eating properly?" Normally, I would have replied immediately, reassured her, given details, proved I was okay. This time, I put my phone down. Not out of spite, out of choice. I finished my work. I went to the gym. I cooked dinner with David. We argued lightly about whose turn it was to do dishes, then laughed about it. I watered the garden. I lived. Hours later, I responded with one sentence. "Yes, hope you're well." And that was it. No follow-up questions. No emotional labor. No invitation. The world didn't end. A few days later, I had coffee with a senior designer at work, someone I respected, someone who'd quietly mentored me since I joined the company. She asked how things were going outside of work. I surprised myself by telling her the truth. Not the details, just the shape of it. That I'd set boundaries with my parents. That it was hard. That I was learning who I was without their constant influence. She listened. Then she said something that lodged itself deep inside me. People who benefit from your silence will always punish you when you find your voice. I walked back to my desk with that sentence echoing in my head. That night I talked to David. Really talked. I told him about the guilt that still crept in. About the part of me that worried I was being cruel. About how final everything suddenly felt. He listened, then said quietly, "You didn't cut them off to hurt them. You stepped back to protect yourself. Those aren't the same thing." And suddenly, the decision I'd been circling became clear. I wasn't going to announce anything. I wasn't going to confront my parents again. I was going to live openly, without hiding, without asking permission, and let reality do the talking. That meant telling them David and I lived together. Not defensively, not apologetically, factually, but I would do it on my timeline. After Isla's board exam, because this time my boundary included protecting my sister too. When Isla finished her exam, she came over for dinner. She looked exhausted, but proud. "I passed," she said, smiling in that relieved, fragile way that only comes after months of pressure. We celebrated quietly. And then I told her my plan. She nodded slowly. "They won't take it well." "I know. But you're not asking for approval anymore." "No," I said, "I'm informing them." That distinction mattered. A week later, I sent the message. Short, calm, unemotional. "I wanted you to hear this from me. David and I live together now. I'm happy and doing well. I'm not open to discussing or defending this decision. I hope you can respect that." I sent it, then I put my phone down. My hands shook, but only for a moment. Whatever came next wouldn't control me anymore. The fallout didn't explode the way I'd once feared. It unraveled. Slowly, predictably, almost quietly. My mother responded first. Not with anger. Not with threats. With disappointment. "I'm very hurt by this decision. I raised you better than this." I read the message twice, then once more. And for the first time, it didn't hook into me the way it used to. Because there it was, clear as glass. Not concern, not curiosity. Judgment. I didn't reply. That silence was my answer. My father didn't text at all. Through Isla, I learned that he'd paced the house for hours after my message. That he'd said I was throwing my life away. That he'd blamed David, my job, therapy, anything that wasn't his own behavior. But something unexpected happened too. My mother didn't show up at my office again. The text slowed, then stopped. It was like she realized the old tools no longer worked. No access, no leverage, no crisis to manage. And without those, she didn't know how to engage. Friends reacted differently. Some reached out with genuine concern. Others awkwardly avoided the topic. A few gently suggested family therapy or meeting halfway. I smiled politely and changed the subject. Because halfway only works when both sides are walking. Isla, though, she surprised me. She didn't withdraw. She didn't lecture. She just stayed. She visited. She texted. She shared pieces of her own therapy journey. She told our parents less and less about my life and more about her own boundaries. Watching her do that felt like witnessing a quiet revolution. And then there was David. He never said, "I told you so." Never framed himself as the hero. He just kept showing up, making dinner when I was tired, listening when grief resurfaced, standing beside me, not in front, not behind. One evening, as we watered the garden together, he said, "You seem more like yourself lately." I thought about that, about how I spoke more freely, laughed louder, made decisions faster, didn't flinch when my phone buzzed. The cost of setting boundaries had been high. But the cost of not setting them would have been higher. My parents lost influence. They didn't lose me. They lost control. And that difference mattered. I used to think strength looked like endurance, like staying quiet, like tolerating discomfort, like bending just enough to keep the peace. That's what I was taught. But this year taught me something different. Strength isn't surviving control. Strength is refusing to live inside it. My relationship with my parents isn't what I once hoped it would be. There was no grand apology, no emotional breakthrough, no moment where everything suddenly made sense and healed. Instead, there is distance. Careful contact with my mother. No contact with my father. Clear boundaries that don't require justification. And that has to be enough. I don't wake up wondering what they think of my choices anymore. I don't rehearse conversations in my head. I don't shrink my life to make it more palatable. I live with a man who treats me with respect. I build a career I'm proud of. I design, create, grow things with my hands. I show up for my sister and let her show up for me. The hardest lesson I've learned is this. You can love your parents and still choose yourself. Choosing yourself doesn't make you ungrateful. It doesn't make you cruel. It doesn't make you a bad daughter. It makes you an adult. If there's one thing I'd tell anyone listening to this, anyone standing on the edge of setting boundaries with the people who raise them, it's this. People who benefit from your silence will call your boundaries betrayal. Let them. Your peace is not a negotiation. My story doesn't end with revenge or reconciliation. It ends with something quieter. Freedom. And for the first time in my life, that feels like enough.